Good evening and welcome tonight for a beautiful, fantastic, marvelous talk on one of the greatest painters, portrait painters of the Renaissance in Italy. But this is just the background of something that was built around an exhibition of his works. The exhibition was organized by Palazzo Strozzi in Firenze, in Florence, last year. I think you might know that the director is a Canadian. Palazzo Strozzi is run by a Canadian. Isn't that true? And it is the second time that I think for an exhibition they decided to publish some other materials apart from the traditional catalog which accompanies an exhibition. In this case, they decided to devote some attention to, the content of the paintings by means of riddles and rhymes. So they had asked Roberto Piumini, who is a very well-known Italian writer for children. He writes children rhymes, he writes short stories, he runs a program on television devoted to children. So he's really very well known, and they asked him to create some riddles and rhymes so as people, children, but not only children, can try to better get into the paintings. And this, of course, has been done in Italian, but there is also the audience that doesn't know Italian. So, for that purpose, they've asked Professor Konrad Eisenbichler to turn these rhymes and riddles in English, which is not exactly to translate them. And this is going to be the topic of the talk tonight. So, how Professor Eisenbichler faced this task, this challenge. And I'm sure it's going to be really interesting to learn what his thoughts were and how he translated from one language into another, recreating them most of the time. The book is wonderful. Just to have a look at it, you see it's really great, and this is the famous portrait of Eleonora d'Artolino, yes, the wife of Cosimo I. Look, also the illustrations have been made on purpose, and it goes on in this way. So I think they have done a wonderful work, also from an artistic and editorial point of view. If you have a look at the other side, you find the English version. Our speaker is, I think, well known to most of you. He is a professor of the Center for Reformation and Renaissance Studies at the University of Toronto. He has written a lot on the subject of Renaissance, on many authors and many movements of the period. And he has also translated a lot. Giovanni della Casa, for example, among other things. And he is one of the friends of the Instituto. So when he told me that he had taken the task of doing this, I said, well, we have to present it to the Canadian audience too. So thank you very much for having accepted to give this talk to me this evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friesen, Dottoressa Friesen. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm so much looking forward to your reactions to the poems. They are poems that I absolutely loved when I read them in Italian, and I loved them even more when I translated them into English. So, I don't know. You'll see from my concluding remarks how vain I've become. Let me just put these things away. I have written out my talk so that I don't go off topic, otherwise we'll be here for 2 hours. I think it's going to be about 50 minutes long, and no more than that. Last year at this institute, I spoke on a collection of children's poetry that the Italian poet Roberto Piumini had composed. The poems were meant to accompany an exhibition of 16th and 17th century tapestries woven for the two Medici queens of France, Catherine de' Medici and Marie de' Medici. My talk was so well received that Dottoressa Frisenna asked me to come back and to do something similar this year. And so I have. This year I'll talk about the poetry that Roberto Piumini and I composed for another exhibition, an exhibition of the paintings by Agnolo Bronzino, probably the best portrait painter of 16th century Florence. Before I do that, however, let me set the scene. Let's start with the location of the exhibition, the Palazzo Strozzi. This is one of the most important architectural monuments in Florence and in Italy today. It is a prime example of 15th century humanist architecture. The palazzo was commissioned by the banker and merchant Filippo Strozzi the Elder, one of the richest men in Italy at that time. The regular cubic form of the building, its enormous size, and the magnificence of its details and decor are a statement not only of Filippo Strozzi's firm humanist ideas, but also a statement of his own sense of importance, not to mention a statement of his obvious economic resources, his political influence, and last but not least, his highly developed and elegant culture. To get the best he possibly could, Filippo commissioned the famed sculptor Benedetto da Magliano to design his home. He then hired the famous architect Simone del Pollaiuolo, called Il Cronaca, to supervise the construction, which began in 1489 and was completed 15 years later in 1504. The palazzo remained in the Strozzi family for more than 4 centuries until 1937, when the family sold it for economic reasons. It now belongs to the Republic of Italy. There's a little story behind that. I met the daughter of the man, the Strozzi, who sold it. And she said he sold it in 1937, but he couldn't do anything with the money because the war that was about to come up. When he finally was able to do something with the money after the Second World War, the money was sufficient for him to buy a Topolino. The palazzo now houses the Fondazione Strozzi, which mounts several major exhibitions a year, the Italian National Institute for Renaissance Studies, and the Gabinetto Scientifico Letterario Vissier, a research center devoted to 19th century Florentine literature and culture. Briefly put, the Palazzo Strozzi is a monument that incorporates within its humanist walls the rich personal, political, artistic, and cultural history. Since 2006, the director of the Fondazione Palazzo Strozzi is, as Dottoressa Frisenna said, a Canadian, James Bradburn, who was born in Toronto and educated here at the University of Toronto, where he graduated in 1974 with a degree in art. He has had a brilliant international career as an architect, exhibition curator, and museum director in various countries, not only in Canada, but in England, Russia, Germany, and now Italy. A highly cultured man, The one characteristic of his that most fascinated me when I met him was his determination to include in all of his exhibitions something that would reach out to and engage children. Not just one or two items in the exhibition like tokens for children to play with, but a complete approach to the exhibition that would speak to these younger visitors and accompany them throughout the exhibition, from beginning to end. For the summer 2008 exhibition of French Impressionist paintings, for example, Bradburn had picnic baskets like the one in Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, available for children to take along with them as they toured the exhibition. As they went along, a variety of objects in the basket referred to what was depicted in the painting and invited the young viewer to connect the object with its representation. A year later, for the winter of 2008-09, for an exhibition on tapestries woven for the two Medici queens of France, Bradburn asked Italy's leading writer of children's poetry, Roberto Piumini. Did I go backwards? Yes, I did. Roberto Piumini, to compose a series of children's poems, that is, filastrocche, that were then published as a small volume by the title L'Occhio Indovino. And these young viewers could then use the volume as they went through the exhibition. Bradburn then asked me to write a similar children's rhyme in English, taking from Piumini, but changing as much as I needed for the needs of translation. The two collections were published simultaneously in a little booklet like you've seen today, with English on one side, and if you turn it around, Italian on the other. Roberto Piumini, the author of these filastrocche, is a multifaceted and very prolific artist. He was born in Etolo, a small town near Brescia, in 1947. A graduate of the University of Milan, he tried his hand at teaching and at acting, but his success as an author led him to devote himself full-time to writing for children. Since 1976, he has published poems, fables, short stories, novels, with an extremely broad spectrum of publishers. He's also composed theatrical works, including musicals. Piumini has collaborated on television shows for children, such as Albero Azzurro, and on radio shows, such as Radicchio. That's a radio show, not a food. And he has translated into Italian over 50 works for children by English authors. Not surprisingly, Piumini has won several prizes. His work, Storia dell'Orizzonte, won him 2 prizes. The Premio Anderson for fables, and the Premio Palme d'Oro. His 1991 volume, Tre d'Amore, won the Premio Letterario Piero Chiara. So when I was asked to translate Piumini's filastrocche into English, I was honestly a little intimidated by the thought of translating a much-published living author. I'm used to dead authors. But a living author with several literary prizes to his credit. However, I grew a lot more comfortable with Piumini's wonderful sense of humor and lively imagination. And when I was given the liberty to change as much as I wanted, it formed the basis for my own ideas about the poems. But before I tell you about that experience, let me tell you about Agnolo Bronzino and his art. Bronzino was born in Florence in 1503 and died there in 1572. His real name was Agnolo di Cosimo, that is, Agnolo the son of Cosimo, which means that he came from a working class family that did not even have a family name. His father, in fact, was a butcher. The name, or more correctly the nickname, Bronzino, was given to him later, possibly in reference to his darker skin complexion, but it's not been proven. Having shown a talent for painting, Bronzino was sent to apprentice with some of the best artists in Florence. At that time, best artists in Florence at that time. The first one was Raffaellino del Garbo, and then the second one was Pontormo, whose portrait Bronzino painted later on. In the 1530s, Bronzino was working on his own, mostly as a portrait painter for the Florentine nobility, producing wonderful works, such as his rich portrait of Eleonora di Toledo with her son Giovanni, or the mysterious portrait of Bartolomeo Panciatichi and his wife Lucrezia Panciatichi, the portrait of the young nobleman Ludovico Camponi in a state of sexual arousal, the sensual portrait of Cosimo I as Orpheus, and the charming portrait of the young Giovanni de' Medici with a bird in his hand. Aside from being a painter, Bronzino was also a poet, and one with an especially racy sense of humor. In fact, he was especially well known for his burlesque poetry, replete with double entendres and bawdy wordplays. Bronzino never married, but when his best friend, Cristoforo Allori, died in 1555, leaving behind a wife and several children, Bronzino took the widow and the orphans into his house and provided for them for the rest of his life. One of Cristoforo's children was a boy named Alessandro Allori, who had a talent for painting and became Bronzino's pupil and eventually his heir, to the point that Alessandro even assumed Bronzino's name, signing his works as Bronzino, and so confusing to no end many generations of art historians. The Bronzino exhibition at Palazzo Strozzi in the fall and winter of 2010-11 was the first, believe it or not, dedicated entirely to the work of this phenomenal artist. It brought together 70 works by Bronzino, that is about 80% of his total artistic production. And it accompanied many of these works with works by his teachers and contemporaries, that is by artists such as Pontormo, Benvenuto Cellini, Il Tribolo, Baccio Bandinelli, Pierino da Vinci, and also the pupil Alessandro Allori. In order to make the exhibition more interesting and much more reachable for the younger viewers, James Bradner, the director of the Strozzi, commissioned a collection of about 20 children's poems, or filastrocche, from Roberto Piumini and from me. The work was meant to be my work was supposed to be a translation or adaptation of Piumini's filastrocche. But since I had to make sure that the verses rhymed and scanned well in English, which is a little bit more difficult to do than in Italian, I was given a free rein to change anything I wanted, and I did. This proved to be great fun. Now, one more prelude. Before I look at some of these poems, let me say a few words about Italian and English poetry. The two languages use two very different systems for writing poetry. Briefly put, Italian counts syllables, English counts feet. And these are two very different things. I'm not talking about human feet, I'm talking about poetic feet. A standard verse in Italian poetry consists of 11 syllables, and it is called an endecasyllable. It comes from the Greek. For example, Dante's Divine Comedy. Nel mezzo del cammino di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, onde la dritta di era smarrita. The standard English verse, on the other hand, is iambic pentameter. That is, a verse consisting of 5 iambic feet in a combination, and an iambic feet is a combination of 2 syllables. The first syllable unstressed, the second syllable stressed. For example, Romeo's lines. Passò What light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, for example. You can read the rest. Italian can vary its verses by reducing the number of syllables, usually from 11 to 7. English can vary its verses by changing the number of feet per verse from 5 to 4 or 3, and by changing the type of foot. That is, instead of using iambic, but soft, what light through yonder window breaks, it can use trochee. Again from Shakespeare, double, double, toil and trouble. Or a dactyl. This is Wordsworth. This is the forest primeval, the murmuring pines and the hemlocks. Longfellow?
Yes.
Long. Okay, I'll believe you. Longfellow. Even my notes say Longfellow, right? Roberto Piumini's filastrocche are all based on an 11-syllable line. Some are also fairly rhythmic in their scansion, but not all of them are. My English renditions use a variety of feet and are, on purpose, very rhythmic. I did this because children's poetry in English is quite rhythmic. One needs only think of Dr. Seuss and his opening verses from The Cat and the Hat. The sun did not shine, or was too wet to play. We sat in the house on that cold wet day. Very rhythmic. And so, let's look at some examples of Piumini's poems inspired by Bronzino's poetry. Let's start with the very first poem in the collection. A poem inspired by Bronzino's painting of St. Michael the Archangel, which is datable to about 1525 to 28, very early in Bronzino's career. Per giuoco l'altalena in verità si va su e poi giù alternamente. Ma vedi, c'è qualcosa che non va in questa altalena risplendente. Un angelo la regge con una mano e il piccolo di destra porta su. Chi è quello che in basso, scuro e strano, l'altro a sinistra tiene e tira giù? Forse questa non è un'altalena, e se un angelo salva l'innocente, chi sarà quello con brutta lena che trascina l'altro giù, dannatamente? You will note that Piumini uses the 11-syllable verse and its rhyme A-B, A-B. In my rendition, I use the iambic pentameter, 5 feet of iambic verse, feet. Also rhyme A-B, A-B. A seesaw, wow, that's lots of fun. You're up and down, you laugh and scream, but look, the seesaw has begun to go off balance. See the beam? An angel holds it in his hand, and on the right, that boy is up. But on the left, a grasping hand has seized the boy that's in that cup. What kind of seesaw could this be? If that's an angel helping out, then who's that figure that I see grabbing the boy that seems to shout? You will notice that the two poems are in fact very close. The demands of rhyme and rhythm required a few changes from the Italian original, but nothing really significant. I did introduce the idea that the two children were boys, an idea that is in fact present by implication in Piumini's use of the masculine for the phrase il piccolo di destra. And I did ignore the value-laden concept whereby the right side is good and the left side is bad. Present in Piumini's poem, when he points out that the boy being saved is by the angel is on the right, il piccolo di destra, and the one being seized by the devil is on the left, l'altro a sinistra. Aside from this one addition and one subtraction, I should also point out that my rendition is a lot more rhythmic than Piumini's, whose verses do not always run smoothly. I hope he's not watching their live broadcast. For example, Piumini's second verse, have I got the right, did I go back? Piumini's second verse breaks completely from the nice rhythm set up in the first verse. Bel gioco l'altalena in verità, si va su, si va giù e poi su alternamente. I really don't like that alternamente, it doesn't work. If one could speak of feet in Italian, one would say that Piumini's first verse is completely iambic. But the second verse is a mixture of two anapaests, short, short, long, one iamb, short, long, and one amphigraph, short, long, short. Another example of this more rhythmic pattern in English is evident in my rendition of Piumini's poem on the portrait of a gentleman, sometimes identified as Pierantonio Bandini. Sì, Pierantonio, sei affascinante con la tua lunga barba ricciolata, con quello sguardo che vede distante la tua ampia fronte illuminata. Sì, Pierantonio, sei molto elegante nella tua seta blu che fa un gioco di arricciamenti, lucida e cangiante, e sotto quella blusa a rosso fuoco. Bello, elegante, ma non crederai che quella bella donna abbia perduto la sua testa per te, ma non lo sai che come amanti degli dei ha avuto. You will have noticed that in Piumini's rendition, the rhythm is constantly changing, and at times makes the poem somewhat difficult to read out loud. My rendition instead is much more rhythmic, even obsessively so. Why, yes, Pierantonio, you're really quite handsome with that long thick beard that comes down into strands. And let's not forget your brown eyes worth a ransom, and that ample forehead or milky white hands. Why, yes, Pierantonio, your elegant nature is clearly revealed by the silk of your coat that shines forth with flashes of deep blue and azure and makes the bright red of your shirt quite a note. You're handsome and stylish, but don't be deceived. That woman did not lose her head over you. Relax then, my friend, and do not be peeved. She's had other lovers, and this is quite true. One of the effects of the much more obsessive rhythm is, I think, the suggestion that the speaker is somehow trying to caress or compliment Pierantonio. This caressing is rhythmic, repetitive, insistent. In this poem, I was also obliged by the demands of rhyme and rhythm to change some of the meaning of the poem, and especially the punchline. While Piumini, in his final verse, suggests that the lady in question has been loved by various gods, ma non lo sai che come amanti degli dei ha avuto, I, on the other hand, suggest that she has been loved by other men. She's had other lovers, and this is quite true. This is clearly a cultural reduction on my part. I am assuming that my reader will not recognize the statuette in the background as a Greco-Roman deity or as an earthly nymph from classical antiquity, but will see it simply as a naked woman, possibly with a towel in her hand. Some of the cultural assumptions and even intellectual assumptions present in Piumini's poetry can simply not be translated into English. For example, in the poem accompanying Bronzino's painting of the Madonna and Child with St. John, about 1530, also in her report painting, the play on the Latin phrase Agnus Dei and on the Italian word agnello, meaning lamb, was simply not translatable. I spent days trying to figure it out and gave up. Here's Piumini. Che sia lassù sul colle a brucare sotto la torre e il cielo nuvoloso, o in riva al fiume a destra a belare vicino a quel castello poderoso, o forse è una figura ed è illustrato sul libro che lei legge di traverso. Dov'è l'agnello? Dove si è cacciato? Forse si è nascosto oppure perso. O forse è solamente una parola, scritta dove sono scritte le parole. Anche se qui non siamo in una scuola, lo può scoprire chi leggere vuole. Nice, very nice. In this poem, Piumini is asking his young Italian viewer to seek the lamb, Agnello, in the painting. Strictly speaking, there is none. So the viewer, the young child, must eventually find the lamb in some other fashion. One way is to locate the lamb in the few letters of script readable on the ribbon held by St. John, Ecce Agni. Which means that Piumini assumes that his reader is able to complete the three letters A-G-N so as to form either the Italian word agnello or the Latin word agnus. The presence of the Latin word ecce adds further linguistic and cultural demands on Piumini's young viewer. Demands which perhaps the young viewer in Italy is able to meet. After all, Latin is taught in Italian schools starting very early, grade 9. I started it in Italian school in prima media, which would be grade 6. It would, however, be totally unrealistic to expect an English-speaking youth to be able to expand the letter AGN into anything that might suggest a lamb. The other way that Piumini's reader may be able to locate the lamb in the picture is to point to the allegorical lamb, that is, the little Jesus, who is the Lamb of God. In this case, too, it may be unrealistic to expect an English-speaking youth to be able to seize the meaning and find the lamb in the picture. Italians are mostly Catholic and therefore would think of the Lamb of God. English speakers are not necessarily Christian. My rendition of the poem therefore takes a completely different approach to the painting and focuses on the script, Ecce Agni, as something completely undecipherable. That was the solution. Can't figure that out. Here he goes. John has written something serious on that ribbon in his hands, but the words are so mysterious that just Jesus understands. Mary wonders, what's the language? I don't get it. Is it Greek? Then she adds, oh, I can manage. Here's my book. I'll have a peek. Jesus knows, but will not say it, for those words will mark his fate. If you know, then you must say it. What's the mystery? Tell me straight. For you, the Dantisti in the club, in the group, I want you to notice that, like Dante, I rhyme the word Jesus with Jesus. That's what Dante does in the Divine Comedy every time. So I feel I did the same thing. Well, no, I didn't. I didn't rhyme. No, I say it. That's it. I'm blind. By asking my English reading youth to focus on the script on John's ribbon as something that needs deciphering, I'm drawing attention to it. By exposing it as something difficult, as a difficult text, I'm asking for an imaginative interpretation. Then, by introducing Mary as someone who is a bit confused, I make the situation a little bit amusing and also bring it down to earth. Mom does not know what's going on. By drawing attention to the book that Mary is holding, I suggest that the book is a source of information that might explain the text. And I'm suggesting that knowledge can be gained from books. That books can be a tool for deciphering the unknown. In my thinking then, this array of more mundane references and situations opens the door to a variety of possible conversations between the young viewer at the exhibition and his or her parents or companions. There are other cultural assumptions, or more precisely political assumptions, present in Piumini's poetry. One of these is a strong anti-war stand, typical of the 1960s and 70s liberal movement. After all, Roberto Piumini is born in 1947, so he's a product of the 60s and the anti-war movement of the 60s. Piumini's poem, accompanying Bronzino's painting of the martyrdom of the 10,000, painting datable 1530 as well, begins with a lament, "Ai, ai," and focuses on the violent and murderous nature of war. Ai, ai, nel cielo, che nuvole nere, in terra, che violenze, che dolore, colpisce e uccide ogni cavaliere, ogni vittima grida, cade, muore. Ai, ai, persino gli angeli bambini lassù scagliano frecce sulla terra. Che scena piena di duri assassini, di rabbia e vendetta, odio e guerra. Ai, ai, lo vedi in mezzo al furore quello che batte su un tamburo grosso? Lo vedi tu quel pazzo suonatore suonare in mezzo al sangue caldo e rosso? In Piumini's poem, even the little angels in the sky and the drummer boy on earth become participant in this carnage that contains no hope of redemption. Violence, pain, blows, murder, yelling, falling, and death characterize the first quatrain and set the tone for the final phrase, in mezzo al sangue caldo e rosso. In my rendition, I retained the negative overtones of Piumini's poem, perhaps even reinforcing them in my final verse. What black clouds in the sky, dear Lord, what violence here on earth, what pain. The dagger drawn with great discord strikes fast and soon a man is slain. From heaven the little angel boys are shooting arrows with great force. This is a scene of death and noise, of anger, hate, and no remorse. And in the midst of all this din, a man plays on his fife and drum. Did you catch sight of him within this crowd of murderers and scum? Though sharing in Piumini's anti-war stand, the English version introduces two important new elements. The first is the concept of no remorse, which may be gratuitous on my part, but does offer a value judgment on the situation, not to mention an easy grind. The other is the idea that the drummer boy, whoops, I went too far. There. The other is the idea that the drummer boy is a fife and drum musician. There's supposed to be an arrow there. Yeah, there it is. Is a fife and drum musician. In fact, Bronzino's drummer does play a fife while beating on the drum. Piumini overlooks the fife completely, possibly because a fife player, the tradition of a fife player, is not very strong in Italy. But in the Anglo-American world, the image of the military fife is much more common. And so I wanted to bring it out much more clearly for the young Anglo-American English-speaking visitor at the exhibition. Although Bronzino's fife and drummer is not quite a child, he appears to be somewhat of a teenager, he does offer the young viewer the opportunity to look at and perhaps empathize with the presence of young men in war. The young person's perspective is, in fact, something that Piumini generally assumes and often underlines in his poems. One of the best examples of his child's perspective is the poem accompanying Bronzino's very early portrait of the young Lorenzo Lenzi, a portrait datable to 1527-28. Shown against the green background typical of Bronzino, the young schoolboy is depicted standing, open book at his side, left hand lying on a table, and the boy is staring at the viewer in amazement, perhaps in bewilderment. Piumini asks the boy a series of questions. Chissà perché hai nel volto, Lorenzino, quell'espressione di mesto sconcerto. Sul grosso libro che tieni aperto hai forse letto il tuo triste destino? Quell'espressione di perplessità è perché devi, compito di scuola, leggere tutto il libro, il tempo vola e tu sei ancora a meno di metà? Oppure accade che tu sia passato davanti a uno specchio a corpo intero e vedendo quel tipo tutto nero all'improvviso ti sei spaventato? Piumini's questions range from a quasi-metaphysical fear of death to a very mundane and childish fear of not being able to finish your homework, to finally the suggestion that the young boy has perhaps been startled by his own reflection in a mirror. In my version, I restructured the poem somewhat, but retained all of Piumini's questions. Why do you look bewildered, Master Lawrence? Why do you stare so strangely into space? There's not a young man, sorry, I misread it. There's not a bright young man in all of Florence who's as perturbed as you with that strange face. Did that fine book reveal what fate is keeping hidden for a future still to pass? Or are you scared that time is quickly fleeting and you won't have the book read for your class? Or did you walk by chance, quite unaware, in front of a full mirror in the hall, where suddenly, distracted by the glare, a figure dressed in black stared from the wall? Thank you. I did not mention earlier that the small booklet containing Piumini's poems and my English renditions also contains two sets of images. One series consists of the image painted by Bronzino with our poem next to that image, very much as they appear on the screen like this. The other is a series of full-page images by a young contemporary artist, modern artist in Siena, Niccolò Angeli, that pick up on something about the picture or the poem. For this painting and our poems, Niccolò Angeli focused on Bronzino's magnificent green and on Lorenzo Lenzi's black outfit to create a profound image of a boy's metaphysical questioning, complete with a full moon in the pitch-black night sky. Angeli also added a wonderful new insight. The mirror in which the boy sees his image is in fact the book the boy is reading. In Angeli's rendition, the little boy's bewilderment at the world is indicated not by the look of bewilderment in the face of the boy, as was the case in Bronzino's image, but by the very facelessness of the small figure confronting the immense book and the frightening full moon. So I think he did a wonderful job with that one. Another good example of a child's perspective accompanying in the poem accompanying Bronzino's portrait of Dante Alighieri. Dante is seen holding the open book of his Divine Comedy, turning to look over his left shoulder at the mountain of Purgatory, while with his right hand he points to Florence standing right above the burning pit of hell. See it? Just barely. I'll give you a better image later. Piumini seizes the opportunity to speak to Dante and ask him questions, which is in fact a role reversal. Because if you remember, it's Dante who's always asking questions in the Divine Comedy. Piumini's questions seem to come from the lips of a somewhat irreverent, I was thinking irrelevant.